These two heads were done by Karl Duldig, my father. The small one here was when I was 8 months old. We'd been forced to leave our home in Vienna in 1938 after Germany had annexed Austria. And the head was done in the hotel in Zug in Switzerland. This one here on top was done 2 years later in Singapore. This head seems to me to be much more vivacious than the one done in Vienna, and I've always wondered why. The fate of our family was principally based on good fortune and fate, but also very much on art. Most Jewish families in Switzerland in 1938 could not find anywhere else to go, and my parents were faced with the same dilemma. But then a telegram arrived from Karl's niece Ina, who was living in Singapore with her husband. On the 3rd of January 1939, she wrote, "Opportunity Singapore, letter follows." It was on that basis that my family left Switzerland for Singapore. We arrived in Singapore on the 6th of May 1939 on the Victoria, a ship of the Lloyd Tristino line. At first it was really hard. Our lodgings were awful and it took a while to become accustomed to the tropical climate. But surprisingly quickly my parents adapted. They put an advertisement in the paper about a new art school, and this advertisement was answered by people of all backgrounds. Karl became fascinated by the many people who thronged the crowded streets of Singapore. He was constantly sketching and modelling his impressions. Karl was also an excellent sportsman, and he played tennis at the local tennis club and met Rudolfo Nolli, who was a sculptor working for the government. Rudolfo suggested that Karl could use his own studio at 47 Scots Road to do some work. It was in Nolli's studio that Karl did a portrait of 10-year-old Eve Flinter and also a wonderful portrait of a Malayan boy. The Straits Times sent a journalist and a photographer to the studio, and on the 22nd of June 1939, a cover article appeared in the weekly supplement, A Malayan Bungalow. Refugee sculptor models first heads in Singapore. The journalist R.M. McKee wrote, "Hitler came to Vienna, and in those few hours Karl Duldig, sculptor and sportsman, lost his career, his fortune and his home. He is now in Singapore, literally carving out a new life for himself with his chisel, his long fingers, and the clay he almost makes speak. Karl gives life to the dull clay. People see with their eyes, but Karl Duldig sees with his eyes and his hands." The article created enormous interest, and suddenly Karl was in great demand for portraits. The Chinese community also became interested when Karl's portrait of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, the Chinese nationalist leader, was bought by the students of the Chinese Yongqing School. Everything was going really well for my parents in Singapore, and they were very happy. However, at the same time, they were really worried about the families they'd left behind in Europe. At first, letters were interchanged between the families, and they got news from Poland, where my maternal grandparents were living and where Karl's family was also living. Karl's brother Ignaz Duldig wrote, "The power of a single man makes all of Europe, indeed the whole world, tremble, and the ever-present Damocles sword that hangs over us adds to our foreboding." On the 3rd of September, Germany invaded Poland and war was declared. There was no more news from Poland, neither from the Duldigs in Przemysl, nor from the Horowitz family, my maternal grandparents, in Lvov. Only Slava's sister Rella, who was living in Paris with her husband Marcel Linné, could still keep in touch. Expéditeur Aurélie Linné, 19 Rue Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Paris, France. This is Karl's drawing of the monk Guan Kuai. Guan Kuai wrote the calligraphy alongside the drawing. He writes, In the summer, I went with Professor Fu to visit the Austrian sculptor Duldig. He portrayed me today, and this poem is for him. Carl's drawing in Chinese ink applied with a brush seems to blend perfectly with the monk's wonderful calligraphy. This photo shows Fu with the monk, my father, and me. Professor Yu was a founder of the Distinguished Chinese Creative Society, whose members were the forerunners of modern Chinese literature. He was an avowed nationalist and had fled to Singapore when China was overrun by the Japanese in 1936. Professor Yu introduced Situ Chi to Carl. Situ Chi would later become a famous Chinese sculptor, and in his biography says that Carl, who was his first teacher, inspired him to become a professional sculptor. My parents were lucky to find a marvellous apartment at 3 St. Thomas Walk. We lived on the second floor, and a Chinese family was living on the ground floor, and I had a Chinese playmate. The wide return veranda of the house at 3 St. Thomas Walk was an ideal exhibition space. My parents mounted an exhibition of sculptures, drawings and paintings, intending proceeds from sales to go towards the war effort. It was amazingly successful, and 16 works were sold to private patrons. The most interesting visitor to the exhibition was Robert Payne, an Englishman working for the British Admiralty. He later became a famous writer who wrote on art and history. Robert put aside money from his pay packet every week to buy a sculpture from Carl. He also sat for a portrait, which is in the collection of Stony Brook University in New York. Payne commissioned the first cast of the Malay Boy. During the war, it was lost, and strangely enough, in 2009 in Singapore, it was relocated, and it is the original bronze cast that is now in the National Art Gallery collection in Singapore. In 1981, Robert Payne wrote a tribute to Carl Duldig, in which he described their time together in Singapore in 1940. In Robert's words, "I liked watching him at work on the upstairs veranda, where the floors creaked and the red ants crawled in long lanes. We talked about what I used to call the marriage of East and West, by which I meant the interpenetration of Western culture with the cultures of China, India and Japan. And now the West, Carl Duldig, had come to the East, and why should there not be a new art compounded out of this marriage?" Unfortunately, the idyllic life that my parents had built up in Singapore in such a short time was soon to come to an abrupt end. The British authorities had classified us as enemy aliens because we held Austrian papers and saw us as a threat to security. On the 22nd of July 1940, my parents received a letter from the Jewish Refugee Relief Committee. It is practically certain that within 3 weeks, all German, Austrian and Italian Jewish refugees, including women and children, will be interned and will be sent out of the country, and they are therefore advised to make arrangements accordingly. It was really ironic that just as my parents received this notice, Carl also received his most important commission. Auburn Hall, the founder of the great tiger balm industry, a liniment which is still used by millions worldwide, commissioned Carl to execute 2 hollow 6-foot life-size bronze statues of Mr. Auburn Hall and another 2 similar seated statues of his brother, Mr. Auburn Pa. Mr. Orr allocated Carl only 1 hour a day between 7 and 8 a.m. for the sittings. Carl paid special attention to the head and especially the shape of the ears, which is very important in Chinese culture. Auburn Hall's distinctive long earlobes denoted a man of exceptional wisdom. By the end of the 3rd week, The 2 plaster figures of the Orr brothers were ready to be delivered to the bronze foundry, W.W. Wagstaff and Sons. My parents tried every possible avenue to try to remain in Singapore. They lodged an official appeal. Other friends also sent letters, including Obun Ho, who particularly wanted my father to finish the sculptures. But it was all useless, and even Obun Ho received a polite but firm refusal from the colonial government. On the 11th of September 1940, my parents received the final notice to leave Singapore. It detailed the following instructions: to attend at the Sikh barracks, Pearls Hill, at 8 a.m. on 18/9/40, ready to proceed to internment. A reasonable amount of personal baggage only will be allowed, and cases of furniture, crockery, and so on will not be permitted. When my parents' Chinese friends realized we were being deported to Australia, they organized letters of introduction to the Chinese community in Australia. Yuta Fu wrote, "I hope our countrymen in Australia will show Carl Duldig some kindness and look after him well." The original was handwritten in Chinese calligraphy, but Professor Yu also gave Carl a typewritten copy in English. The principal of the Yongqing School, which had bought the Chiang Kai-shek bust, wrote a glowing reference. And the monk Guang Kwai transcribed a Buddhist poem by the Zen master Long Ya Mi, depicting the transitory nature of life, and gave it to Carl as a parting gift. With all the successes of my parents, they were really sad to leave Singapore. And my father wrote a really poignant letter, which he addressed to nobody and which was never actually sent. And in part it said, "In deep sadness, we feel ourselves displaced far away from lands where we spent so many years. Set apart and alone, we are like 2 children who have suddenly been transplanted to a lonely island. Think about the dearest who far away have undergone and suffered so much. Will we ever see them again?" The day of departure came, the day of the end. I see before my eyes the beautiful sight of the sea and Singapore. Singapore, which in such a short time left the deepest impressions on me.